Crowe Horwath are our accounting partners here on the country branches right around the country. I think 24 at last count, including in Central Hawke's Bay, Waipukurau, where we catch up with Sean Bennett. Who said accountants were boring? Last time we spoke to this bloke, he was about to head off to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Today he's going to talk about carbon neutrality and carbon forestry. Sean, I challenge you to make the latter subject interesting, but before we get into that, I want to talk about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain or peak obviously in the African continent. What encouraged a middle-aged accountant to do that? I'm not being cruel calling you middle-aged, am I, Sean?
No, I could actually be past middle-aged by now, you never know. I did Machu Picchu a few years ago, and we had a handful of mates that were quite keen to do Kilimanjaro for some unknown reason, so we decided we'd have a crack. So, yeah, wonderful trip and absolutely amazing bit of landscape. I think Kilimanjaro is actually the highest freestanding mountain in the world.
That's the interesting part of the chat. Can you make carbon neutrality and carbon forestry an interesting subject to talk on? Because there's a lot of confusion out there amongst farmers and foresters about the emissions trading scheme. My eyes glaze over when I talk about it, and carbon credits, right? Way you go, Sean.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was one of the key takeouts from a field day we recently had was that confusion around the ETS and obligations and opportunities. So MPI are working hard to address that. They realise there's an issue with the communication. People have said, that every time we have a change in government, they seem to change the rules. So they're aware of that. I think Minister Jones reiterated that point last week. They need some consistent messages. So they're away working on that. But I think for agriculture, there's a realisation that we are going to be in the ETS. Don't know what form it's going to look like now after the Zero Carbon Road Show. But we are going to be in ETS, and that's going to create some obligations, but it's also going to create some opportunities.
Can I have a look at those opportunities, particularly as it pertains, I'm talking farming here, to shelter and erosion planting? So can you plant for shelter and erosion and cash in with some carbon credits along the way?
Yeah, sure, and that was one of the other takeouts from the day as we had someone come in and actually look at the plantings on farm, and this farm had done quite extensive plantings over 30 years, and yes, there was definitely an opportunity to link those up and just be a bit more strategic with our planting. And you're right, we've always planted for erosion and for shelter, but now here's an opportunity, if we're just a bit more strategic about what we do, then we could create another income stream. So that was one of the big key takeouts. And the other one was around the carbon neutrality. So we did a back of the matchbox calculation for this farm. And if anybody wants to try that, it's roughly 12 hectares of pine trees per 1,000 sheep. And you can use willows and poplars and put them in the same category. And this farm was definitely carbon neutral many times over without even looking at its pine trees, and we've done a couple of others since then, and they are definitely carbon neutral or well on the way. So there's a big opportunity for us to have a competitive advantage here, Jamie.
Is it easier for sheep and beef farmers, should I say, to be carbon neutral than, say, dairy farmers? It would have to be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So beef and lamb, latest figures say that 24% of our natural vegetation's on sheep and beef farms. So I think at some stage we're going to have to help our dairy cousins out here because we're all lumped together for agriculture in New Zealand. Under the ETS, it's not going to be splitting out the various sectors, so we're all in this game together. They're doing as much as they can with genetics and grasses, etc. But yes, definitely much harder for them.
Hey, plant a pine tree for a cowcocky. Can I ask you, when does a shelter belt become a forest? And I say that because it needs to be a certain length and a certain width, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's got to be average 30 metres in width, so it can be a metre at one end and wider at the other. It's got to have a 30% canopy cover, and it's got to be able to reach 5 metres at maturity. So the reason it's 5 metres is because you get a bit of old man gorse that's 4 metres high. You don't want to be knocking that over and having to repay some carbon credits for that. So I think a lot of what we need to do is just being strategic around our planting and the opportunities that we actually have. When we look at carbon neutrality, we've got beef and lamb. That's a key pillar of their new strategy. In Hawke's Bay here, we've got our regional council wants to be carbon neutral by 2040. We've got farmers that are sheep and beef farmers that are already carbon neutral or well on the way. And I think that's where the opportunity is for us to maybe fight back a little bit against the synthetic protein guys and tell our own story and tell it well and back up what we're doing.
Sean Bennett from Crowe Horwath, thanks very much for your time today on The Country. Can you please just repeat that back of the Matchbox calculation regarding the number of pine trees you need per 1,000 sheep?
Yeah, sure, Jamie. Yeah, from our calculations on the day, it was 12 hectares per 1,000 sheep. So that's just a, rule of thumb measure. If we're going to do this as an industry, we're going to have to be a bit more scientific around that to back it up. But that's the back of the Matchbox.
Fascinating number, and a real opportunity for the sheep and beef industry anyhow to be carbon neutral by 2050. Thanks for your time.
No, welcome, Jamie, and nice talking to you.